Strength and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come. She openeth her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. Proverbs 31, verses 25, 26, and 31.
Welcome to the In Her Image podcast, where we are seeking and celebrating our Mother God through scriptures, scholarship, the arts, and everyday life. I am Jess Burdett, and tonight I am joined by a guest who I've had the privilege of seeing some of her art. It's incredible, especially in person, but she's also on Instagram, so you can see some of her artwork there, and some of it is featured in the Girl's Guide to Heavenly Mother, sold by Deseret Book. And she is just an incredible artist who includes a lot of intricate and beautiful symbolism into her pieces and is just very thoughtful as well as extremely talented. So thank you so much for joining me tonight, Esther. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about all these things.
Awesome. And I forgot to ask you beforehand, but is it Esther Hi'ilani?
Hi'ilani
Candari.
Yes.
Great. So you might recognize that handle from Instagram or that name from an art show or the book. So excited to have you here. First of all, I'd love to hear a little bit of your background of how you started painting and how you became interested in the subjects that you paint.
Yeah. So short of it is I started out as an art major studying sculpture and went on my mission. And when I was on my mission, they discontinued the sculpture program at the school I was going to. And so I had to assess whether I wanted to change schools or change majors. And after a lot of thoughtful prayer and arguing with God, I felt very strongly I needed to change majors and stay at the school I was at. And so the two options were I could do graphic design or painting. And I am not the biggest fan of being on a computer all the time. And so I was like, yeah, no, graphic design is not for me. I will go insane. And so I was like, I guess I'll do painting. But I'd drawn a little bit before, grew up kind of just sketching, as much as the average sort of art-interested high schooler does, nothing super spectacular. I'd taken a few classes before my mission, but I'd never actually painted before, other than like craftsy watercolors.
Oh, wow.
And so it was a really steep learning curve. I was 21 at the time, just gotten back from my mission, and it took me about a year to feel like I had any idea what I was doing. But every time I thought about quitting, I just felt like I needed to stick it out. And so I spent a lot of time crying by myself in the painting studio at school. Definitely feeling inferior a lot. But it slowly started to come together. And, it always entertains me when people look at my stuff and they're like, oh, you're so talented at painting. And I'm like, no, I'm not. Like, I really don't think I'm naturally talented at it. I think there's some things in life that I'm naturally talented at. I think I'm good at looking at complex ideas and finding ways to represent them visually. I was naturally talented at sculpture. It's part of the reason I picked it because I just fell into it so easily. But painting is something I've really had to work for. Mm-hmm. But in some ways, I really appreciate that because it's given me a deeper sense of gratitude and ownership of that skill because it's not something that was handed to me. Yeah, so I has a little background about why I paint, and it's ended up being a really good thing because I love sculpture, but it's much harder to produce work that can be disseminated easily with sculpture, and I've realized that I have things that are really important to say, especially in the religious space, and so I'm grateful that I'm in a medium now where I can create things that are able to speak to and be distributed to a broad audience, whether it's book illustrations or posting stuff online or actual doing physical shows, just all those different routes that you can do with two-dimensional art. And then as far as topics in my art, I grew up in a mixed-race family, and I grew up in a very culturally diverse community. I grew up in Hawai'i, where everybody I grew up with was mixed race, pretty much. And there's definitely kind of pockets of different communities where you had more concentrations. There's a strong Asian community, a strong Polynesian community in Hawaii, and then, all sorts of various European, American influences as well. And so growing up in that environment where it was very normal to go to church and have this very diverse cultural background that people were bringing to the table in the way that they approached the gospel, and even the family history stories that they told. And being able to attend cultural celebrations for lots of different cultures within my immediate community, and just having that as a normal part of my life growing up. You assume what you grew up with is what's normal in the world until you realize that it's not. And coming on my mission to Utah was kind of that. I'd kind of seen it before traveling with my family and things like that, but it was a real slap in the face to be at the heart of the church and realize that it did not reflect the church that I'd experienced everywhere else. Because I grew up in Hawaii going to church there. I lived in Hong Kong for a little bit. I've lived in the Philippines for a little bit. Traveled a lot. I've been to church in mainland China, and just all these really wonderful experiences of experiencing the church in its beautiful variety. And then the homogeny that I experienced in Utah was kind of a little bit of a shock. And not that, there's definitely areas in Utah and wards that are better at embracing diversity, but it's not the rule of thumb. And so for me, it was kind of a reminder of how much these conversations are needed and how much these images are needed. And it also started to wake me up to how much what is produced out of the homogeneity of Utah is then forced upon, that's kind of like strong language, but benevolently. And we talk about like a benevolent patriarchy. The church has benevolent white supremacy. And it was, not something I was raised to look for. I came from a more conservative family politically, and just kind of, even though I was used to multicultural approaches to life, I didn't think to question when it wasn't there. But once I started questioning and looking for places it wasn't there, it was everywhere. You don't realize how ingrained it is in the system, but as soon as you start pulling that thread, everything unravels. So it just really sent me down this whole path of, I guess you could say, felt like I had a mission to create work that represented the religion that I had experienced growing up, and that I loved, not what was sort of enshrined in the classic LDS visual culture, which basically is Utah in the 80s to the early 2000s. That's what we're currently functioning with. Is where a lot of that art is coming from. But yeah.
Yes, which is not representative of most members of the church, right? Just because it's kind of the center of where a lot of church members live, or where they ended up living in the beginning. We have so many members all across the world. I also think, too, being able to pursue a career in the arts is a privilege. And, I recognize that for myself, that I have an opportunity that a lot of people of color do not have within the church, because it's a big economic risk. And it's also not something that a lot of minority communities encourage their children to do. And so some people might not even realize it's an option. And I think that's part of the reason that I'm so committed to creating these images, is because I recognize that I have that privilege. And so I need to use that privilege. And that's something I love about how I was raised. Polynesian culture is very collectivist. It's very much about, your community invests in you and you invest back in your community. And so that's always been a worldview that I've had, that the people who helped raise me made sure that I made it to college, did well in college, and, financially supported me in various ways. And so now I need to turn that back around, and how am I giving back into that community with the work that I'm doing? Beautiful. I love how you're using that privilege, and I love how directed your path has been as well, with changing your major and kind of having that, that wasn't something that you sought or that you wanted, but something that happened to you. I feel like that looks like that was very divinely led, and I just love how you're trying to give back and serve the religious community and all these different cultures. So let's dive in and talk about some of those specific pieces. The two that I want to talk about specifically are Makua, which I think is the first one that I saw of yours, of Heavenly Mother. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Heavenly Mother. And this is one probably a lot of our listeners have seen. Would you like to tell us give us a little description of the painting, and then tell us what inspired it and where it has been?
Yeah. So one of the authors of the Girl's Guide to Heavenly Mother, MacArthur Krishna, reached out to me a couple years back and she was working on the book and told me, she's like, hey, I really need a Polynesian representation of Heavenly Mother. You were recommended to me by someone. Is this something you're thinking to do? And the timeline was kind of short because there were some things going on with the book or some stuff had gotten pushed around. And so I had like 3 months to finish it, I think it was. And as she was talking about it, I was in graduate school full-time at the time and also working full-time. So I didn't have a lot of extra time to take on additional projects. But I knew right away it was one that I needed to do. It's just, there's moments with art where the light bulb goes on and it's just kind of like, it almost feels like God turning on a flashlight and highlighting something in my life and being like, this is something you need to do. And there's plenty of other things I do that I'm like, okay, I know this is doing good in the world, but there's few moments when it's just like, yes, this is why you're here right now. And that was definitely one of those. And so she was talking to me about the general idea she had and the direction they were taking with the book. I immediately knew it came to me clearly. This is what your image needs to look like. This is who your model needs to be. And so I told her, yeah, I'll do it. And I called my mom because I was living in Virginia at the time for graduate school. And the model that I knew I needed to use is a lady from my home ward in Hawaii. And I was like, there's no way I can afford to or have the time to make it back to Hawaii to take reference images of this woman. So I need to go see if my parents can do it for me. So I called up my mom and I just started explaining the concept of the topic. And even before I got to what I needed, she's like, oh, you need pictures of Auntie Emma. And I was like, how did you know that? She's like, because it's a no-brainer. And the reason it was a no-brainer for both of us is Auntie Emma, so the woman who's the model for this painting. She's like 6'2", I think. Just absolutely regal Polynesian woman. Kind of almost has this otherworldly feel to her because she's so tall and so just big in a very proportionate way. And she's got hair for days. Just this huge, like a halo of white, curly, like super thick curly hair. And she usually wears it down. She just wears it down and out and super natural. She's the mother of, I think, 9 kids. It's enough that I don't know for sure because there's always, they drove a 12-seater van. It was just a big crew. She was also a widow, so she was raising all of these kids by herself. But she always had time for all the kids in the ward. Like she was the type of person where if she knew something good had happened in your life, she would stop and ask you about it and talk to you about it. If she saw you doing something that you shouldn't, she would come smack you, even though you weren't her child. Like, and that's a very Polynesian approach to parenting. It's kind of it's a communal thing. And I feel like she represented that to me and represented the matriarchal model that I'd seen in a lot of the communities I grew up in, just so perfectly, both in her personal life and visually as well. And so my mom took some pictures for me. I had like kind of this general idea of some plants I wanted to include because in Polynesia plants have a lot of symbolism. And so we ended up including a breadfruit tree in the image. So that's the big leaves and the round fruit in the background of the image because it's kind of the equivalent of putting wheat in a painting in a Western standpoint, where breadfruit is a core starch in the Polynesian diet. And so it's symbolically used to represent nourishment, whether that's physical or spiritual, and also concepts of family across the Pacific. And so I feel like this idea of that God nourishes us, that God cares for us, that we are part of this eternal family was very central to it. And then as far as the figure itself, she's wearing some symbols of royalty. So a feather crown. Feather ornamentation in Hawaii is traditionally made with feathers where you can only collect 2, maybe like 4 off of a bird, depending on what type of bird it is. And so to create an entire crown made of solid feathers was a years-long endeavor. And so even though to the average person in a Western context are like, feathers, like cool, whatever. Like this was like gold. It was a very labor-intensive, very economically expensive product to make, and so it was typically only worn by high-ranking individuals. Mm-hmm. And then a fan is another symbol of status as well. They'd have a lot of different ceremonial fans and things that represent your status or, what ritual you're participating in and things like that. So we just included a basic fan in there as well. And then the background is gold leaf and in a solid shape in the background. I think it's 24 karat gold. And that one I did as reference to medieval art. So in medieval art, especially when you see depictions of heaven or interactions with the divine, they have a solid gold background, and the reason for that is medieval artists believed that heaven was beyond description. And so the only way that they could represent this concept of something that was so glorious beyond description is basically a gold void. Like, it's precious, it's glowy, it's sparkly, like, we don't know how to even start drawing it. So we're just going to put gold in the background. But I love the symbolism of that, and it was kind of a fun way to tie into some of, the Western education that I have as well with, the Polynesian cultural context that I was coming from.
Interesting. That's so cool. Thank you for sharing about all those different symbols and about, what was her name? Auntie
Emma.
Thanks for sharing about Auntie Emma. She sounds like such a gem, and I love that she was able to model for it. That's so great.
She's fabulous.
And this piece, I know it's been in some art shows, right? As well as in the Girl's Guide to Heavenly Mother. And is that one currently being shown in Provo, Utah?
No, it was up at Springville for a while. So it's actually part of the Springville Museum permanent collection now. And they had a show titled something about like images of God or something like that, or picturing the divine. Like, how do we visualize this concept of God? And so they included that one in the show. And it's now in one of their storage rooms again. But I'm sure it'll come out again. All the team there, every time I see them, they're like, "This is our favorite painting. We always love when we can bring it out." So it will for sure make some more appearances at some point.
Good. That's so great. I got to see that in person when I went to Utah one time. My parents live really close to Springville, so they're like, "You have to come and see this Springville Art Museum.
Yeah.
And you're going to love this one exhibit that they have in particular."
Yeah. It was actually the cover photo for the spring. It was the fall edition of the Spring Salon 2020 because of COVID. Everything got shifted around. And so it was kind of surreal seeing that printed, 4 times its actual size on big banners in front of the museum.
That's so cool. I love that. I'm so glad that you took the opportunity to say yes when MacArthur asked, that you had that flashlight light bulb moment. That's really cool. And I love that people continue to get to enjoy that piece whenever they bring it back out and in the Girl's Guide to Heavenly Mother. So, and then the second piece that I would love to hear your process and these cool details on is She Who Shall Become. And I got to see this one in person too. I feel so spoiled right now. So I live in Texas, and I flew out to Utah just to see the Certain Women art show. It was like one of those days where you're looking at flights and it's like $30.
Yeah.
And it was right the weekend that I wanted to go. I was like, I'm going to Utah just for an art show.
That's awesome.
So this one just, wow, took my breath away. I just stood there and looked at it for so long. It's so just magnificent and regal. So tell us about this piece.
Yeah, so Certain Women, they usually put out their theme for the show a little over a year in advance. So you've got lots of time to plan and really create a statement piece for the show. And when they sent it out, I just finished up everything with the piece from MacArthur's book. And so I was like, I don't really want to do a direct depiction of Heavenly Mother, even though a lot of people interpret this painting as that, which, if that's how you connect with it, I'm a big believer in what meaning you bring to the art is just as important as what meaning I'm trying to communicate. I don't believe I need to force my vision of the piece on you. So, if you're listening to this and you saw this piece and thought it was Heavenly Mother, go for it. Keep believing that if it makes you happy. But what I wanted to approach with this was this concept of what the doctrine of Heavenly Mother teaches us. So what narrative are we able to find empowerment from by coming to understand the nature of God? And it was kind of this funny crossroads between thinking about this aspect and then some other research that I was doing for a solo show that I did earlier this year that focused on stories of women in the Old Testament. And I'd taken a slight detour into the New Testament during some of my research, and I was going down the rabbit hole of researching Queen Candace of Ethiopia, who's mentioned once in, I want to say it's Acts. Can't remember off the top of my head. But there's a story of a chariot driver who is in the chariot reading his scriptures. He's in Jerusalem on a work trip and ends up joining the church because he runs into one of the apostles. I think it's Paul. And so one of the things that's mentioned is that he is a head servant for Queen Candace of Ethiopia. And, this is me reading between the lines, so there's definitely room for different interpretations here, which I think is one of the beautiful things with the scriptures. But going on the kind of facts that we have, this servant was in Jerusalem, which it was a big port town, but it was also a huge religious mecca. And so chances are, if you were there, you probably had some connection to Jewish religion, Jewish ritual, Jewish culture. He was reading the Torah, which means obviously he personally was practicing some form of Judaism. And that means that Queen Candace was at least open to Jewish religious practice, if not potentially even herself, because there is some strong evidence in history of exchange between Ethiopia and Israel, both pre and post Christ. That's why you have like the Coptic Christians that have such an early history of practicing Christianity. They're like one of the most archaic, and not like in a bad sense of that word, but like very original in a sense, Christian practices out there. So it kind of, trickled down there fairly early on and then just sort of stayed there and didn't go through a lot of the same iterations that, Roman Catholicism has gone through, or even, that Protestantism has gone through. Anyways, I was down this rabbit hole trying to figure out, okay, who is Candace? Like, there has to be more information on this queen, and it's interesting that we're mentioning a queen as the ruling party of a country, not a king. And what I found is that Candace is actually a title. So Candace is the anglicized version of Kandanke, which I'm probably not pronouncing that right, because that is, Ethiopian languages are not my forte. I've not studied them in any sort of professional sense. But it referred to either the older sister or the mother of the king. And the way that the monarchy was perpetuated in Ethiopia, and there's also some overlap with this in Middle Kingdom Egypt as well, is instead of a king getting married, having a son, and that son becoming the king's oldest sister would have a son. And then that son would become the king. And then her daughter would bear the next king. So it was, even though, like, they still had a king, the Kandanke played a very crucial role politically, not just because she was bearing the next king, but she was also typically fairly involved in the politics of the country. And it was this very fascinating sort of circular matriarchal descendancy of power that we have that you don't see other places. So I thought that was really fascinating, that the women held so much influence over the lineage of the royalty and then also the roles that they played. Mm-hmm. So then I followed him. This is me taking you down the rabbit hole with me. So then I followed that string over to parallels in Egypt, which kind of shared, there's a lot of overlap between Egyptian history and Ethiopian history. And Middle Kingdom Egypt is where you see the most overlap. And that is where you see the either sometimes wife, sometimes older sister, or sometimes sister who is a wife, sometimes mother, some sort of like close female relative of the pharaoh. Basically, she spoke on behalf of one of the chief gods in the Egyptian pantheon. And the idea being that she was a mortal manifestation of this god's wife, and so therefore she could speak for him, and played a really key role in giving the pharaoh God's word and giving, people practicing in the temple God's word as well. And what blew my mind is the more I dug into it, the more I realized that this wasn't some like tiny niche academic theory or, tidbit of information, but there was a lot of evidence for practices similar to this, different iterations of some sort of a chief priestess sort of figure as a close family member to the reigning male political leader. And, first of all, that made me angry. I was like, I was a big nerd in high school. I read like every book on Egyptology I could ever find just for funsies. And I'd never read this. It's like, how did these stories get buried when they really aren't buried that deep? So that's what inspired me to take a more Egyptian route to the symbolism, because I'd found all this basis for female spiritual and religious power in the Egyptian religious practice. And so I thought it would be really fun to tie some of those things in as a way of communicating this concept in imagery that is, fun and interesting to the viewer, but hopefully not too obscure as well. So in the image itself, and you can pause me if you have any questions, like, you've got me going. I can talk for hours on these things.
Oh, I'm on the edge of my seat.
Yeah. So this piece, you've got a woman seated, and the woman who modeled for me is actually a member of my ward back in Virginia. And when I took the pictures at the time, I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to use them for, but she just has this very regal, royal look to her. She's a very beautiful woman, and just, again, one of those people whose personality just shines through. Like, she just has a sunshiny personality. And it just, I don't know. I have people in my life that are like, I want to paint you. And sometimes I don't always have a project to line them up with. And so if I know I might not be able to get photos of them again for a while because I'm moving or they're moving, I'll just have them over to my studio and be like, hey, we're just going to take 200 pictures of like interesting poses. And then eventually I'm going to use these for something. And this is one of those situations where it worked out really well. And she was actually 8 months pregnant with her youngest child when we took these photos, which I actually really like that ended up being part of the image, even though it's not like super clear that she's pregnant in the image. It adds this kind of fun maternal layer, but I like that it's a secondary thing. That, when we're talking about the divinity of a woman, the concept of motherhood is part of that complete picture, but it is only part. That there's a lot of other things that make a whole and divine and celestial female being.
Love that.
Yeah, so symbolisms that I wove into her image there. She's wearing a crown. That one's, nice and no-brainer. But the symbol on the crown is an Egyptian symbol for the sun, or the god Amun, which is the highest god. There's some interesting parallels if you dig into that with LDS belief for God. LDS religion and Egyptian religion have some very interesting overlaps. Like, some things are totally left field compared to like where we're at, but other things are just crystal clear, clean overlaps. It's really fascinating to me. She's got some fun jewelry on, again, just sort of like symbols of royalty and power. I pulled a lot of the jewelry from the Met collection. So I looked at pictures in the Met collection online and then painted them into the image. On her brooch, she's wearing, again, a sun symbol, but it's the specific sun symbol. You've got a sun as a half crescent, and then you've got little rays reaching down, and they terminate in hands. And you see this a lot in Egyptian art history. And what it's a symbol of is the divine, the sun, offering connection and knowledge and power and light to the mortal. And so that's why we have these rays extending from the sun, terminating in hands, this idea of offering that. So that's the brooch on her robe. Which, again, in an LDS temple perspective, robes have a lot of symbolism. And even, throughout lots of different cultural and religious traditions, robes play a big part of symbolizing spiritual authority and spiritual power. And then in her hand, she's holding a lamp, which has a couple of different layers to it. Obviously, lamps provide light. They provide, in a symbolic sense, access to knowledge, access to information. But then in a lot of ancient temple rituals, both Egyptian and Hebrew, smoke ascending to the heavens, whether it's from a fire or from incense, represents prayers. This idea of information flowing up to the divine from the mortal. So, it's this two-way communication. So you've got the divine reaching down and the mortal ascending. And then in her hand, she holds a scroll. Because something I think we often don't think about in context of the divine feminine, this idea of having a heavenly mother, is that we always talk about God creating laws and God creating commandments to protect us and to guide us. And LDS theology has been so locked into a patriarchal view of God for such a long time that, at least for me, myself, and maybe this is just me, we default to this idea, this visual of a man writing the laws. But I have absolutely no doubt that she was there, at the very least with Heavenly Father writing these, if not authoring some of them mostly on her own. Because I'm pretty sure they divide and conquer. I'm married and I know, we don't do all things exactly the same, and we don't all have the same strengths, and there's some things that I do all of it, and there's some things he does all of it, and so I'm sure that reflects in our divine parentage as well. But yeah, this idea that God creates laws, and that's something that we will have the opportunity to have power over if we understand that this is what we are working towards, that this is our potential. Last two things. And I'm sure there's more that I'm forgetting, because this is one of those paintings I spent probably 3 months researching just for this painting. Wow. That wasn't 3 months full time, but a couple hours every week reading things and taking notes and doing sketches. So it is so crammed full of symbolism, some of which I don't even remember right now because it's been a little bit since I painted it. So there's two water symbols in the image. She's got a big jar next to her, which is a water holder, again, one that I took from the Met Museum collection. And then there's a river running in the background. that has a lot of ties into Egyptian mythology and their resurrection narrative, as well as just the concept of purification. World religions around washing equals becoming spiritually ready, becoming spiritually pure, washing away sins, all of those things. And then the columns in the background are lotiform columns, so they terminate in a lotus flower, which is a symbol of resurrection because lotus flowers go under the water at night and come up in the morning and open out. And so they represent rebirth in a lot of cultures, but especially in Egyptian culture. So when you see them in Egyptian art, it's usually a reference to narratives of regeneration, rebirth, resurrection. On the columns are excerpts from the Book of the Dead, which is a common scroll in Egyptian history that had the rituals that were to be performed to prepare a soul to enter the presence of God, which, from an LDS standpoint and the process of the temple endowment ordinance, it's pretty clear parallel there. Now, a lot of the content that's in the Book of the Dead has no parallel, but the concept and the process that you would walk through in, a pyramid or an Egyptian temple to prepare this soul to meet God has tons of parallel, both in like hand gestures that were used, even some of the topics that were explored. And so it's just kind of a fun way to reference that. Now, I'm sure there's a ton of grammatical errors in that, since I couldn't perfectly copy everything from the manuscript to wrap it around in this painting, but it's a very loose interpretation. Oh, I lied. There's one more thing. I'm staring at it here. On the side of her throne, which is actually a replica of a real Egyptian queen's throne, there's an inscription in hieroglyphics that says, "Priestess to the Most High, she who shall become as God." I have a cousin who's just finished getting her master's in Egyptology. She's going on to get a PhD in Egyptology now. So I texted her and was like, I need a phrase that's not gibberish in hieroglyphics. Can you translate this for me? And so she did that. It was really cool. And I actually have something that was very meaningful to the image in hieroglyphics, and not just, whatever random little birds I could sketch.
That's awesome. I love that. Which is, I guess, where you got the title for this piece, or vice versa, "She who shall become." That is so beautiful. I love knowing the history of the painting and the symbolism behind it, and that it is of a priestess. I've been thinking about priestesses today and how I want to better embody or claim that title for myself, because we're told, that we can become queens and priestesses. And so it's really fun to think about that painting and to think, I am like her, I can be the priestess in the painting. And so whether I connect with, oh, maybe that's Heavenly Mother in the painting, or maybe that's a priestess, either way, right? Either way, it's my destiny. So I love that. And I hope that people can see themselves in her form. And she really does look so regal and confident and beautiful. So one thing I wanted to comment on too was when you're talking about the scroll and how she had written the laws as well, and how, this priestess or Queen Candace, had a lot of political sway. I've loved learning about justice and mercy and contemplating how Heavenly Mother has a role in both. Originally I might think, oh, he is like justice and she is like mercy. But it doesn't take too long down into my journey to start to think, no, she is justice too. And he is mercy too. I mean, obviously, we know that.
Have you ever met an angry mother? That is the most intense form of justice you will ever find.
Amen. Amen. Yeah, so I love contemplating that and thinking too, about asking, how can I become more like both of you, Heavenly Parents, and what aspects would you like me to work on? Do you want me to be more, XYZ?
Yeah.
And so I love thinking about those qualities and how we might better embrace all of our divineness, no matter where it comes from, right?
I think it's important too to consider sort of these halfway points between our current state, our current experience, and a celestial being. Because I think it gets really easy to look at this concept of a celestial being and our trajectory towards that and feel like it's just too much of a gap. And for me, contemplating the temple and how we engage with those ceremonies and that symbolism has been really helpful, because it's, it's supposed to be this sort of halfway point, this gateway to heaven here on earth. And I feel like, especially as a woman, I had the opportunity to work as a ordinance worker right after my mission, and I mostly worked in initiatory, which has always felt like this little sliver of the bigger picture to me. Like, what is talked about in initiatory and the fact that women are officiating, I always had the feeling when I was in there that this isn't everything. That there's more to this, and that eventually we'll get more to this. And so it's something that I always come back to when I'm feeling frustrated with the patriarchy of the church, when I'm feeling disempowered. I'll often go do an initiatory session because I'm like, this is right. And I had a really cool experience in the temple. It was not too long after I finished this painting. It's funny how, like, I will, like, cognitively understand things and, like, study things from a very academic perspective, but they don't always, like, emotionally and spiritually hit me right away. And it doesn't fully sink in sometimes, even though I can regurgitate the information to you. And this is one of those where I just finished this painting about this concept of a priestess and how it's important to understand, like, that trajectory from, woman to priestess to God. And I went and did initiatory, and I was having a really rough week, and one of the female ordinance workers pulled me aside and gave me some very pertinent words of wisdom. Like, she didn't know me, I didn't know her, but she was being a mouthpiece for God in that moment, and just exactly what I needed that day. And as she was talking to me and providing me with this wisdom, it hit me. I'm like, she is a priestess. And I was like, duh, you know that. But it like had never fully emotionally processed for me, because women and priesthood are such sticky words to combine in LDS culture. And so I think my brain had subconsciously divided them in my head. And so I'd never looked at either myself as an ordinance worker in the temple or the other ordinance workers when I attend as a patron in that light. And it was just, it was so wonderful. It was just one of those tingly, warm, fuzzy, all the best feelings sort of spiritual moment.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that experience. I think a lot of us can relate to that, where we want to believe that those words can apply to us, but deep down, sometimes it's hard to connect to them because we've got some like kind of blockage. And it just makes me think of the phrase like living beneath our privileges. Like we have those promises and those blessings and that endowment on us. And so of course, we are allowed to rise up and claim those blessings and live from that place and call each other priestesses.
Yeah, amen to that. I also think we get really locked into one interpretation or one viewpoint of our theological writing and narratives or our liturgical practices. So the scripture that we started off with today, a lot of people joke about Proverbs 31 as being sort of this like epitome of the biblical woman, perfect housewife and all those things. And that was kind of the perspective I grew up with, because like oftentimes when I heard it quoted in church, it was to be like, grow up and become a good wife, be a crown to your husband, all of these things. And it was actually for my BFA thesis at BYU Hawai'i, I decided to break down this chapter and show how it could apply to so many different perceptions of womanhood and so many different like applications of female power. And it was so funny because once I approached that chapter with that mindset, it became something totally new to me. And it really redeemed this chapter for me, because I looked at it and I was like, this is a woman who is a savvy businesswoman. This is a woman who is a creative, artisan and craftsman or craftswoman. This is a woman who is making important economical decisions independently. Like, talks about like, yes, her husband trusts her, but it's like, he's like, I don't like, you're an equal partner here, and you can go do whatever you need to do, and things are running great, you know? And she is someone, you know, she's speaking wisdom. She's speaking the law. She is empowered in her community, and she doesn't need to have accolades to prove her worth, because what she is doing within her community in all these different ways shows the value that she is providing. And not, you know, that she has inherent value too. That's not necessarily just because she's just providing it, but that she is of value. And it was just, it started me on what will be a lifelong journey, I'm sure, of questioning how I read the scriptures, and questioning how I interpret, you know, my experiences in the temple, and questioning how I interpret my experiences at church, and asking, is this what I'm actually supposed to be learning? Or is this just what I assume I should be learning? And that has been very liberating for my experience.
That's beautiful. I love that chapter too. And I read it once and was just so like inspired, and thought, I want to be that woman. And I've read it other times and thought, like, wait, does this mean that, you know, to be a good woman, I have to like work all day, wake up early, you know, like, it's not always inspiring to me. But when I read it from the right mindset and in the right, like, energy, I guess, it is an incredible chapter. And I think it's mostly like she is an agent unto herself, and she's doing these things that she wants to do and that she is good at. And so I think when I focus on those parts and think how I can apply that to my life, it's such a beautiful chapter. I love that you studied that and did that for your thesis. That is such a cool project. So kind of along those lines, like, what do you hope to see for the women of the church and for minorities of the church, for people in general? What is kind of your vision and hope for our future?
I hope that people have the courage and the faith, I would say as well, to claim their own power and claim their own relationships with God. Now, I think there is purpose and reason to the organization of the church. Like, I definitely have my own personal struggles with it, but I'm on the board for Dialogue, and we had a Sunday school recently, and Rachel Steenblick was presenting a lesson, and we kind of got down this track of talking about how chaos and order are this dichotomy you see represented in a lot of different philosophical and religious paradigms. And in Eastern paradigms, chaos tends to represent the woman and order tends to represent the man, which when I first read that, I was like, no. But then I was like, okay, like, because, you know, in my life growing up, chaos was like a bad word. But the more I've thought about it, and again, kind of you're saying, like, it's not like women are only chaotic and men are only order. Like, there's plenty of overlap and mixing and sharing of identity and strengths. But it goes back to this idea of you need both. And I think in a church that is completely self-directed, where every single individual is making their own decisions and nothing is correlated or coordinated at all, it is complete chaos and nothing gets done. And it was, so I lived back east in the Bible Belt during graduate school, and it was always interesting seeing churches where that was a little bit more of the trend and seeing how much they struggled to maintain a cohesive community compared to the church I grew up in, which is sometimes too cohesive because we tend to focus a little too much on the order sometimes, I think. And just being like, okay, so how do we balance this? You know, how do we claim this personal autonomy, but also recognize the good that can be done from trying to maintain an overarching order and, you know, having humility to accept revelation from leadership, but not blindly so. Something that I try to really encourage people to do in general is sift through all of the directives that we were given and the things that we think we need to do and really pick apart, okay, where am I actually being taught doctrine? And, you know, what are the really hardline policies that, you know, I need to follow within my calling or whatever it might be? And where is all the gray area? Because there is a whole lot of gray area when it comes to actually practicing within the Latter-day Saint religion. And that's where we can really claim power and do good in our communities while still being part of that community. And, you know, I have nothing against the people that just step completely outside of that and find their own power in other spaces. Like, if that's what you need right now, you do that. But if you are wanting to still be engaged in the structure, in the community, look for the space between the lines where you can write your own stories. So like an example of that would be, a lot of people assume that they can only use church-approved art at church. And the only place that that's true is what actually gets hung on the walls, like in the hallways and in the foyer. The church has policies for that, which I have issues with, but that's not something that like just a person myself can go and like rehang something in the hallway of the church. But there are no policies in the handbook as to what images I can show during my Relief Society lesson. There are no restrictions on what images I can use in the postcards that I send to the sisters I minister to. There are no restrictions on, what I can print and hand out to my class. Now, as an artist, don't just go willy-nilly printing everybody's stuff. Like, check with people first, because copyright and all. But, the idea being that if I don't like the image of Jesus that's being used, I can fix that in my little circle of influence, whatever that looks like in your calling. At the very least, I can hang an image in my home, because that is the center of the church. We are a home-based, church-supported religion.
Yes, I love that.
I'd say that's the essence of it.
And that's kind of how we connected this week. Was you shared with me that you were over your ward Zoom and you changed the little picture of Jesus to be Rose Daytalk doll's depiction of Christ, where he looks more Middle Eastern. Mm-hmm. And I love that. I love that we can be creative and think outside the box and think, what influence do I have, and what ways can I share a more holistic view or a more authentic view of how I live the gospel, kind of going back to the beginning of the conversation.
And I think people are nervous to do that because we have such a structured and rigid culture, and so they're not always sure how people are going to respond to it. And I think two things to keep in mind. One, people rarely respond as bad as I think you assume they're going to. Like, chances are they don't, either A, care as much about it, or B, don't have as much of an issue with it as you think they might. It's like, with that thing, like, I have a pretty conservative ward, but the bishop was totally cracking up that I was changing the picture. And he's like, you're an artist. Like, I trust your judgment. Like, if you think that's a better picture, like, go for it. He might not have like read into some of the subtext that I was making there, but he didn't care. He trusted my authority in that situation. He'd given me this calling to do this, and he trusted me in that. And I really appreciated it. And I think the other thing too is people will react badly sometimes, but it's your relationship with God, and that's what matters. And, end of story.
Yep. Being able to hold our own space and keep our relationship with God as forefront and paramount, which is not always easy to do, but such a good thing to learn. And I think really part of why we're here on earth is to become agents unto ourselves and prioritize worry about our own journey. Yep.
For a church that preaches so much about free agency, we're not always the best culturally at helping people practice that.
Yeah.
And I think
it's true.
I think we're getting there. Like, I've really appreciated a lot of the changes that have been made recently as far as creating more open-ended church programs and curriculum and allowing things to be much more self-directed in many ways. Like, even just making the handbook public. I think that was a huge step in allowing people to understand how things function and make informed decisions for themselves, instead of just trusting that it's going to somehow trickle down through the hazy bureaucracy.
So true. And I think we help the process along when we seek out ways that we can exercise our own creativity and our own autonomy and spiritual authority, our own priestesshood, right? So, Esther, my last question for you tonight is, how has Heavenly Mother changed you?
Ooh, that's a deep one. I grew up always knowing that I had a Heavenly Mother, as I think most people in the church did. And I also grew up not really talking about her, as I think most people in the church did. After my mission, I struggled a lot spiritually. It's funny, a lot of people are like, my mission was this huge bolstering experience in my life. And while there were some things that really built me spiritually on my mission, it was also the hardest thing spiritually I've ever gone through. I had some pretty abusive leaders on my mission, and the kind of general tone that was set in my particular mission felt very corporate and not religious. And I was always that kid that like wanted to be the teacher's pet and everything. And that's kind of the approach I took to my mission. A lot of the time was, just trying to do my best to function within this system. And when I got home and I looked back on my mission, I realized that the times that were actually the most spiritually invigorating for me were the times when I'd stood up against that structure and done what I felt I was being personally inspired to do for my investigators, even if it went against, the formulaic perception of what an investigator's journey is supposed to look like. And that was really hard for me because it made me question everything to some extent, but, the purpose of authority and the fallibility of authority. And, having had some definitely sexist experiences on my mission, why did my voice and participation as a woman matter in the church? Especially since, I wasn't one of those people who came home and got married right away. I didn't get married till I was in graduate school. And so, I didn't fit into the nice little neat box of have babies and become the primary president. And so when MacArthur asked me to do that project, I hadn't, I started playing a little bit with diving more into the concept of Heavenly Mother, because that was about the time when things started picking up a little bit on social media, and I'd seen some of that and kind of dipped my toes in the water. But doing that painting and having to connect with the concept on a personal level and portray it in a personal level, it flung that door wide open, and it was exactly what I needed at that point in my life, because it allowed me to reclaim my own power. It allowed me to reconnect with my own divinity, because I had a clear picture of what that divinity was. And even the fact that it's a doctrine that's had so much red tape around it and so much stumbling blocks, you can say, even that was empowering to me, because I felt like I could look at the divine mirror and be like, you're going through the same things I'm going through. People don't see you. People don't want to talk about you. People fear your power, I think. And so it's okay that I'm experiencing that too, because if you're still able to do the good that I know you're able to do, despite all of the ways that mortals have tried to bind you, I'm going to be able to do good despite the ways that mortals tried to bind me. And that was life-changing for me.
That's so good. I keep thinking of the word empowerment all throughout this conversation as we've been talking. It's like, it just feels so empowering, like seeing these images that you've created of a priestess, of Heavenly Mother, and hearing your stories of finding her yourself and finding your own powers. It's so just inspiring and enlightening, and I'm really, really grateful for that, and for the ways that you have stepped into your power and just followed the path that you have felt called to, and that you're just owning your own journey and not just doing it in the prescribed way anymore. I really admire that, and I'm grateful that you've come on and are sharing your experience with us today. Is there anything else that you would like to share before we end?
I would say something I think about a lot with the topic of Heavenly Mother, and this is kind of a big gear switch, is how do we get the men on board? And the reason I think about this a lot is I grew up around guys. Like, I have 4 brothers. Obviously I'm married now. One of my brothers lives with me. My brother-in-law's over the house all the time. I was a tomboy growing up, and I was lucky to have really spectacular, honorable men in my life at various stages. But, I've also had experiences with dishonorable men. And I feel like, especially within the church, some of the experiences I've had with men that were less than savory or really belittled me, sometimes they were, especially the experiences I've had with benevolent patriarchy and benevolent misogyny, if you can call it that, would have been solved if these men understood the doctrine of Heavenly Mother. Because they would have a framework for female power. They would have a context for individual female divinity. And so even though I love that the women of the church are opening their hearts and minds to this right now, and that it's just rolling forth with such power until the men are on board, because, you know, for better or worse, that is the power structure in the church. Mm-hmm. We will still be fighting such an uphill battle. And so, yeah, I don't know if I have a solution to that, but I'm just, something to think about is like, we need the men in these conversations. And not because, you know, we can't have these conversations by ourselves, but because it's a team effort to create a community where equality exists. And so if we want that equality to exist, let's try to get the whole team in the boat.
Definitely. And just like you are using the privilege that you have to create art and create more representation of diversity and help people feel seen, men have privilege as well, and some more than others, and they're able to affect change in unique ways. And so I think it's important for us to have the conversations with the men in our lives, and for men who are listening to have conversations with each other and to think about what ways they can incorporate this doctrine better into their family life and into their church spheres and just whatever sphere of influence they have. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that's really important too. It's definitely a team effort. It needs to be a partnership.
Yep. I also think, just on a personal and theological level, there's things that I would miss out if I only had a relationship with my Heavenly Mother and didn't have one with my Heavenly Father. And there's things that men miss out on if they don't have a relationship with both. And I think a lot of the issues we see in today's culture with toxic masculinity is because any character traits that are associated with the feminine, and, you know, I believe that feminine traits and masculine traits manifest in both genders. Like, there's things that I do that I would label as masculine, and things my husband does that I would label as feminine, and things that, you know, kind of as a broader philosophical concept. I feel like a lot of the things that we struggle with trends of toxic masculinity are because men have lost touch with the more feminine aspects of themselves and feel shame and hesitancy to connect with those, even though it is righteous and good and divine.
So true. Normalize embracing the femininity within everybody. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Esther. Thank you for everything you have brought to this conversation, for your experience, your thoughts, your advocacy, your passion. It's been such a privilege talking with you, and I hope that your art and your ideas continue to spread far and wide, because you truly do have important things to say. So thanks for saying them here today with us.
Yeah, you're welcome. Happy to.
And if you're not already, follow Esther on Instagram at Hi'ilani Fine Arts. That's Hi'ilani Fine Arts. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it. And if you haven't yet, please leave us a review. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can make a monthly donation at anchor.fm/inherimage. We hope you'll tune in next Sunday for another inspiring episode.